Have you ever known exactly what you need to do, but you felt just unable to do it? You have this idea, you know you need to do it, but you just can't bring yourself to live it out. Maybe it's something that you know that would help you personally. Maybe you know that you need to work on your happiness, or maybe you know you need to work on your health, or maybe you know that there's things that you need to do just to make life better for yourself or your family, or maybe it has to do with how you interact with society. You know and you feel in your heart that you need to take a certain stance, you need to do something today to make a difference. Maybe it has to do with a cause or a candidate that's in the world. You know that you need to let people know, to advocate for a certain cause, for justice. You know exactly what you need. Don't care, not because you don't believe, not because you don't know that that's what you need to do, but you just find yourself unable to do it, or maybe you find yourself avoiding it. There's actually a word for this. It's akrasia or something like that. It's a phenomenon of acting against one's better judgment. I don't know if anybody's ever done that before. You know, acting against your better judgment. It's when somebody intentionally does something while simultaneously believing that a different way of living would be better. It comes from a Greek word that means something like weakness of will. This idea of knowingly choosing something you know that you don't need to do. And this is a question that psychology has taken up, trying to understand the ideas that shape us and what that means in life and the things that we do against our better judgment. But I think in a lot of ways it really comes down to the fact that we all have competing commitments in our lives. We all have competing commitments. You may feel very strongly that you need to do something, but you always have something that's competing in your mind. Maybe you feel unable to do it because you think that the cost of doing this new thing would be so high, or you don't feel like you have enough time to do it, or maybe there's some other obstacle that is out there. There's fear involved, a fear perhaps that it will hurt a relationship. There's a desire perhaps for self-preservation, a need to protect yourself, a need to protect those closest to you, so you don't live this certain way, or you don't take that public stance, that there's something inside of you that feels like you need to do. Today, as we continue our message series of looking at unlikely witnesses, those who met Jesus on the way to the cross, on the way to Easter, this tension between conviction and self-preservation sits at the heart of the story that I want to share. But before we find our unlikely witness, I want to kind of set the scene of what's happening in the very last hours of Jesus' life. What we have is that Jesus had just met with his followers. They had a meal together, and then after this meal, they go to the garden known as Gethsemane. And when they go there, they go to pray, and Jesus asks his followers to come with them. But while they are there praying, a mob of people show up. And this mob of people is actually led by one of his other followers, a guy by the name of Judas. And Judas is there to betray Jesus. And in the midst of this, Jesus is arrested. And then they lead him away to the high priest and the religious leaders of the day. And all of Jesus' followers at this time, except for one, fled. That one left was Peter. He had not yet fled. So what was happening is that Jesus was about to be put on trial, and if you read about it, it's a sham trial of people coming up with false accusations to share against Jesus. Mark tells us about this story in Mark chapter 14, verse 54, that Peter followed this group from a distance. Peter followed him from a distance. He followed him from a distance right into the high priest's courtyard. So what's happened is that Jesus is taken to the high priest's house and is kind of thrown into a pit, and there's like this questioning happening around him. And Peter has followed up to this point, and he's out on the outside. He's standing in the courtyard. He's sitting with the guards. He's warming himself by the fire that's outside the residence of the high priest. And so inside, it's a different scene. Inside, there's accusations. Inside, there's slander that's brought against Jesus. We read that people brought false witness against Jesus, and one after another, they tried to build a case, and eventually, they just all yelled out, "He deserves to die. He deserves to die." Now, this was not an orderly trial like you might imagine today. When I think about a trial, what I think about is the county courthouse. You know, this old building that is a stone building that sits up on the hill, and you go inside. You got to go through metal detectors, empty your pockets, you know, and then walk up the stairs to get to the courtroom. And inside the courtroom, there's some attorneys sitting around there. There's the judge that sits up on the dais. There's other people kind of floating around there, and it's all kind of contained in this one building. It's all contained in this one room, and nobody outside the room, and especially nobody outside the building, hears anything that's going on, because the walls are thick, the windows are closed, the air conditioning's going. Nobody outside hears what's going on. But this is not the way it was in the first century. In the first century, the building where the high priest was conducting the trial, it wasn't this great big building. It's a much smaller place, especially by today's standards. The windows would have been open, the sound would carry, and Peter would hear everything that was going on. He may not hear word for word everything was going on, but he could get the gist of what was happening. He could hear the screams. He could hear the shouts of the people that were trying to slander and trying to convict Jesus. And earlier that evening, when they were eating the meal together with Jesus and his followers, Peter had told Jesus that he was never going to abandon him, that Peter was going to stay with Jesus, even if it meant going up to the point of death. And so here we have, Jesus is brought into this trial, and Peter is following along right on the outside. And so it seems, and it looks as if Peter is going to follow up on his word, that he's going to stay with Jesus to the very end. He's close to the trial. He's right outside. He's warming himself up. Perhaps in this moment, he knows exactly what he needs to do. Perhaps he knows that as he listens to what's going on, he can hear Jesus being mistreated, and he knows what he needs to do. And then Mark gives us another look at Jesus, and our first look at our unlikely witness today. So this comes from verse 60 or 66 of chapter 14. We read this: "Meanwhile, Peter was below in the courtyard, and a woman, one of the high priest's servants, approached and saw Peter warming himself by the fire. And she stared at him and said, You're also with Jesus, the Nazarene." But Peter denied it, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're saying. And he went outside into the outer courtyard, and then a rooster crowed. So Peter's still outside, warming himself by the fire, close enough to know what's going on. And this is what fear often looks like. You know, not completely abandoning it, but staying at a distance. And it's here at the edge of the fire that an unlikely witness appears. And we don't even get her name. We just know her as a woman. A servant girl of the high priest. Other translations, refer to her age and being young. We don't know her name in history. It is likely that she is young. It's noted that she's a servant, but more likely what that means is that she's a slave. And women at the time were part of a lower social status. Women were part of a lower social status, and as a female servant, as a female slave, this young woman, this servant woman, would have been at the very bottom of any social hierarchy. She would have been at the very bottom. She would have no power and no prestige. She was left out of all things that were important. In fact, the one that she is working for is the same one who is mistreating and challenging Jesus. And as someone with no power, no prestige, as someone with no right to speak, especially to speak in the front of men, she has everything to lose by speaking. She has everything to lose by speaking, but yet she speaks. Now, if you've ever read this story before, maybe you've imagined, like I have, that this woman, this servant girl, is a threat, that she's an accuser, that she's allied with those that control her, that with her owner, I guess, the one that she's a slave to, her enslaver. And so maybe it's assumed, I've always assumed that she was a threat and accuser, that she was allied with the temple authorities, that she's out to get Peter when she confronts Peter and said, you were with him. You were with this this Jesus guy who is in here? And it's easy to assume that she is there and is wanting to get him arrested, to hand him over to the authorities, to make Peter face the same shame that Jesus is facing right now. But what if this interpretation is too easy? What if she wasn't trying to get Peter arrested? After all, Mark doesn't tell us about her intentions. But what if instead of trying to get Peter arrested, she was trying to get Peter to wake up? Here's how the story continues in verse 69. The female servant saw him, and again, a second time, anyways, she saw him, and I fumbled over my words and whatever. But she didn't, okay? So the female servant saw him and began a second time to say to those standing around, this man is one of them. Now she had to go out, she had to find him, and then she had to speak not just to Peter now, but she's speaking to those who were standing around him, speaking up to other people. And she says, this man is one of them. But again, Peter denied it. A short time later, standing around again, she said to Peter, you must be one of them, because you are also a Galilean. Others are now joining in on this accusation, but at this time, Peter's had enough, and he cursed and he swore, I don't even know this man you're talking about. Notice the escalation here. The young woman, the servant woman speaks to Peter. He denies it. Then she sees him again and begins to bring others into the conversation and speaks to others and says, you this is the Peter guy. This is somebody that is with Jesus. I know it is. And so she speaks to those around him, and again he denies it. And then somebody else is brought in, and again Peter grows louder and more defensive and more desperate. Yet he has a chance. He has a chance. There is a reason, we don't know it for sure, but there's a reason that Peter followed Jesus to this place when everybody else had fled. Everybody else ran and hid, but Peter followed. And maybe Peter is experiencing a call to do something daring. Maybe he's experiencing a call to step out beyond his fear, to do something. Maybe he's experiencing a call to stand up for Jesus and to say something in his defense. And maybe he's being called to do something right in the moment. Maybe he knows exactly what he should do, but he just feels unable to do it. And then here comes the servant girl. And we have to wonder about her. Now, if you've read anything about Jesus' ministry, you know that Jesus lived with people who were kind of on the edge of society. He preached to those who were in power, but more than that, he spent time with those who were out of power. He spent time with those who were trampled by power. He spent time with those who were sick, those who were in prison. He spent time with those who were considered slaves in society. He spoke good news to the poor. He brought liberation to those who were in prison. He brought healing to those who were cast aside. When people were hungry, literally hungry, he fed them. He had compassion on those who society had written completely off. Jesus loved those that society marginalized. Jesus loved people just like the servant girl. One without power, one without a voice, one at the bottom rung of the social ladder. And what if she had heard Jesus teach? What if she had seen Jesus give sight to the blind? What if she had seen him enter the temple and challenge those in authority like her enslaver? What if she had seen him turn over tables of those who partnered with her enslaver to turn the temple into a marketplace? What if she had seen him challenge the very people who enslaved her? And what if she believed? What if, like so many people in her position, she just hoped that somebody would help her, that anybody would finally stand up for her? And what if she wondered if that somebody might be Jesus? She sees Peter. She stares at him. She looks at him and she wonders, you're one of them. You're one of them, aren't you? You were with Jesus. You must be one of them. Perhaps this was not the voice of accusation. Perhaps this was a voice of urging Peter to faithfulness. Perhaps this was a voice of urging Peter to do what he thought he had been, what he was going there to do in the first place. Perhaps this was a voice of calling him to take a step into faithfulness that he knew he should be taking in the first place. But Peter is consumed with fear, and Peter resists. Sometimes the voice we resist is the one that is urging us towards faithfulness. Sometimes the voice we resist the most is the one urging us to faithfulness. And then the scene closes. At that very moment, verse 72, the rooster crowed a second time. Peter remembered what Jesus had told him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down, sobbing. The rooster crows, the rooster reveals, the rooster wakes Peter up in a way the servant girl couldn't. And Peter realizes what he should have been doing. But he still couldn't bring himself to do it. So he sobs. He breaks down. He runs away. He had an invitation. He had an encouragement towards faithfulness, and he resisted. It really doesn't matter how what the servant girl's intentions were. Inside of him, he could have used that as a chance to step up, but he resisted it. The story of the servant girl and Peter reminds me of people throughout the ages who have spoke up and who have made a difference and encouraged people towards justice. I especially think of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who called people to action during the middle of the 20th century. And I'm always struck by a letter he wrote while he was in jail in Birmingham. We know it now as the letter from a Birmingham jail. And King didn't write this letter to his loud and violent opposition. He didn't write this letter to people who were burning crosses and who were threatening violence. King wrote this letter to fellow clergy. He wrote this letter to other pastors, to people that stood before congregations and lifted up the gospel. He wrote this letter to people, other pastors, specifically white pastors. You see, what had just happened before King was in jail here, 8 white clergymen had published a statement urging people to stop protesting. They had urged people to stop protesting, to be more respectable, and to rely on the courts, and just to wait for a better time, because now it's a little violent. Now it's not the best time to advocate for justice. This was the opinion of many people at the time, and especially many white clergy. And King addresses them as my dear fellow clergymen. My dear fellow clergymen. He responds to their claim that his actions are unwise or untimely. And he wasn't writing to people who were openly cruel or openly violent. He was writing to people who were quiet. He was writing to people who were distant, who refused to act even if they believed that the act would ultimately be right in the end. And he famously says that he's been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. Those who are more devoted to order than to justice. Those who prefer a negative peace and the absence of tension over a positive peace and the presence of justice. King wrote in frustration, but he also wrote to awaken. He also wrote to call to action. Perhaps he spoke like the servant girl because silence was the greater danger. He wasn't attacking faith. He was calling people to a greater faithfulness. I'll confess with you, sometimes as I look at the needs in the world and the pains that we see around us, I ask myself, would I be one that King would write to? If I were active in ministry, if I were alive, 70, 80 years ago? 60 years ago, however many years ago, in active ministry, trying to help people find Jesus? Would I have been one of those that King would have written to? When I look at the justice issues around us, when I look at the pain around us, would I be one? Am I doing enough? I don't know the answer to that. But I ask you, where do you find yourself today? Like Peter, do you know exactly what you should do, but feel unable to do it? Is there a voice you're tempted to dismiss? A friend calling you to be more than you are? A call for justice calling you out? A child calling you to be better? A colleague calling you to be more? Maybe there's something inside of you calling you forward to walk out, to do what you know is best, to do what you know and you need to do. And maybe the voice sounds like the servant girl. You're one of them, aren't you? You're one of them. Well, why don't you stand up? Why don't you speak up? Why don't you do what you know that you need to do? I mean, fear is still there. It feels risky. It threatens your sense of control. But a voice stands there. And in the legacy of the servant girl and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, the voice is not always the enemy. Sometimes it's an instrument of grace calling you to greater faithfulness. Maybe the voice you want to silence the most is God calling you forward. So I invite you to consider, what voices in your life have you tried to silence? What voices in your life may you be trying to silence today? Where do you feel called to act in your own life, in your family, in the world, but you feel like you can't? If you know exactly what you need to be doing, if you know exactly what you've been resisting, maybe your prayer is simply, God, give me the strength to be faithful. God, give me the strength to be faithful. If you're not sure what this looks like, here's one thing you can do. Have an honest conversation with somebody else. Find somebody you trust, maybe in a small group, your belong group, a Sunday school class, or just a relationship that you have, and ask them to name a place where faithfulness is calling and where fear might be holding you back. Because the thing about Peter is this calling was revealed in relationship to this servant woman. And sometimes the calling that God has on your life is revealed in relationship to somebody else. Sometimes we need a relationship to find the courage, not to debate, not to fix everything, but just to name it. Now, Peter's moment happened in relationship. And he didn't follow through at the time. And even though he didn't follow through, we learned later, if you keep reading the Bible, that he got a second chance. And what I want you to know is that regardless of where you've been, regardless of what's been calling you, even if you haven't been faithful to it, you get a second chance too. That Jesus always offers a second chance. What if the voice that you want to silence the most is the voice calling you to greater faithfulness? Let me pray for you. God, sometimes we hear hard voices in our lives, in our world, and it's just hard to know what to do with them. We don't like opposition. We don't like when people tell us things that we don't want to hear. But sometimes that message that we don't want to hear is exactly the thing that we need to hear. So right now, oh God, I pray that you would speak to each one who is here. That if there's anyone here that's been resisting a call on their lives, that you would give them the courage to step forward, to step into greater faithfulness. That if people are struggling to know what their calling is in life or what they need to do, I pray that you would put them in relationship with somebody that can help them, that can help them ask the right questions and step in your faithfulness. Reveal to us, oh God, that the voice that sometimes is the hardest to hear is the voice calling us to greater faithfulness. I give this all to you, and I pray that you move in a powerful way. Amen.